Hello everyone, Alexa Donne here, and at incredibly long last, I am finally doing it from first draft to final draft for Pretty Dead Queens, my fourth book and my second thriller. Because I have waited so long, such a mess, it means I'm doing this 3 years after I finished this book, 2 years after it came out, almost 2 years after it came out, like a year and a half after it came out, and it is 2024, 5 years after I started it. I started this in 2019. It's gonna be a journey for all of us to remembering how the heck I wrote this book. But I do these videos because people seem to really like them. This one has been requested because I've not done it for such a long time, to give you an inside look at the process of what it's really like for me as a writer, because it's different for every writer, but what a first draft of a book can look like and what a writing process can look like and how it ends up as a final book. In particular, if you're new to this series, I always go really in depth with the notes from my editor, what she asked for versus what I did, so you can hear, like, I say no to plenty of things, or I synthesize a note and she might give a specific suggestion, I go no. But like, she gets to the heart of an issue and then I have to figure out how to fix it. And it's also just fun if you have read the book. This is a full spoiler talk, so don't watch it if you haven't read the book, or watch it if you don't care about hearing all the spoilers for the book if you haven't read it. I go full spoiler so you can know kind of like, oh, that was the origin of a scene I really liked, or the thing behind a character I liked or hated, and that's when she came up with the twist or what have you. Which kind of brings us to the origin of this book. I always tend to work backwards. That's a thing for me with my thrillers. I start at the end, but the genesis of each individual one, it does vary. So with the Ivies, it was a motive. I worked backwards from a twist. I was like, wouldn't it be cool if? This one, I technically also worked backwards from a motive / twist. But whereas with the Ivies, I knew that twist motive, but not who did it, and I kind of crafted a world and characters around it. This evolved backwards from a character-driven twist from the very beginning. And talking about this book as it came out was always so hard because I love the twist in this book. I wrote this entire book for the twist, and specifically a meta internet joke. And it popped into my head years ago in 2019. I like have the record of the chat where I was like, ooh, what if? On May 9th, 2019, I messaged a friend like, ooh, because there's been kind of a meta internet joke for years that Cabot Cove in Murder, She Wrote has such a high murder rate. People are dying there all the time. And who is at the center of every murder? Jessica Fletcher. Jessica Fletcher has to be a serial killer. It's a joke. It's funny. I love Murder, She Wrote. I hope you love Murder, She Wrote. If you haven't watched Murder, She Wrote and you want like cozy grandma murder solving realness from the 80s, it's like peak 80s. Highly recommend. It's all on Peacock. But I went that. I want to write that. So this is my homage to Murder, She Wrote. It's my like YA modern twist on Murder, She Wrote. And I worked backwards from that twist. So I knew there had to be a grandmother who was a best-selling murder mystery writer. I knew it would be writer meta, so fun, but how would I find my way into that? And so we should talk a little bit more about inspiration, because one of the most interesting things about kind of anyone's writing process and idea genesis is where things come from. And I'm always encouraging you guys, like, soak up things like a sponge and file things away for later. My books have a very long germination process. I started germinating on this in 2019. I was still finishing up the Ivies. My mom was dying from cancer, which will come up. She died. Spoiler plot twist. My mom died as this was percolating, which did impact the book in quite a significant way. But there were a couple other things as well. Around the same period, Jezebel posted this fascinating article about our queen, Nora Roberts. how Nora Roberts essentially owns the town in Maryland. Did you know that? Now you know that. In the sense that she and her family are the majority like real estate holders in this small town in Maryland, and they have revitalized and they drive the economy of this small town because Nora's fans all will come visit this town in Maryland because they love her. So like they own the bed and breakfast. I don't know if they own the bookstore, but they support the bookstore. The bookstore hosts like exclusive signed editions. She has stuff in her books that's inspired by this town. So her fans make pilgrimages to this town. And I was like, I want that energy. So I basically combined Nora Roberts owns the town in Maryland energy and has a fandom that visits with Jessica Fletcher serial killer twist. I was like, phew. And then just inspiration happening that summer. Also that summer, I read a really fascinating article in the LA Times about coastal erosion and how specifically coastal erosion in California and other places is becoming a class war. It's a very class-driven issue because I have to remind myself not to get into the weeds, which I also have to do in the book. But it fascinated me because essentially some of the most valuable real estate is beachfront property. Who can afford beachfront property? Incredibly rich people. Coastal erosion threatens to and will eventually literally take their homes away to the sea. To save their homes, they sacrifice the beaches. Beaches in California are public. So who pays the temporary price? Because even when you sacrifice the beaches to protect the homes, the article made clear because of coastal erosion, this is the case in California, Florida, lots of places, in 50, 60 years, these homes will be gone. You cannot save them long term. You can only save them in the short term. But who pays the price in the short term? Literally the taxpayers, because this is all tax money, and the public, especially the kind of public who can't afford a beach house because the beaches in California are public and they take away the beaches to save rich people's homes. So I love that kind of stuff. And it was just percolating, and that's when I was like, okay, I'll make it a California town. I live in California, so it fit. I hadn't set a book in California yet. And Cabot Cove, Maine in Murder, She Wrote is Cabot Cove, Maine, but they filmed it either on the television lot or in Mendocino, California. So I was like, okay, Northern California vibes to get more of that homage to Murder, She Wrote in the book. And so that all was percolating that summer. And then it was also, okay, who's my main character? This is YA. How am I going to get them to this town, this small town, to move in with their grandmother? And how would they not know that their grandmother may or may not be a serial killer? You know, there has to be a sleight of hand with a twist like that, which is I loved writing this book. It was really challenging. It took me forever. Like, I mean, it was the book that took me the longest to write until I wrote The Bitter End, which took like 2 years. This was like 18 months straight of drafting and editing with my editor. And it was intense and it was a lot, but I loved it because the fun part was designing an entire plot to hide the sleight of hand and the plot twist I knew I wanted to do. And you know, I'm crossing fingers even though it's been out for a few years, but like for the most part, people I talk to who love the book love the twist. The 1-2 punch twist worked. I basically had to design an entire other subplot with suspects and red herrings and a solution to one mystery to hide the other one so that I could punch people in the face. I solved one mystery in like a slightly more obvious way. We're gonna talk about it just for this. But how do I get this teenage character there? I wanted it to be an estranged grandmother, and also my thought process. Okay, there's only so many ways that you can have a teenager move in with their grandmother senior year of high school. So many reasons. And before my mother died, I was, I've done dead parents before, and I was trying not to have so many dead parents. It's such a cliche in YA, or I should say dead moms. In my first 2 YA books, dead moms. The Ivies had an alive mom, but she doesn't really participate in the story. So I was like, could I get away with not having a dead mom? But a thriller came out that summer with a similar-ish setup, not the same, completely different stories, but it did a live mom. And it did a live mom in a way that I was thinking of doing a live mom. And then my mom died, and I was like, well, might as well go with a dead mom. Let's process some feelings. Let's use real life inspiration in the darkest, most morbid way possible. So Cecilia's mom died of cancer exactly the way my mom died of cancer, and Pretty Dead Queens became my super fun therapy grief book. I promise it's a fun ride. Like, it has some serious elements to it, and it's definitely, of my 3 thrillers, the most serious in the sense that I inadvertently like did something with this in terms of the character arc and the depth of the character arc. But it's also ridiculously frothy and fun. It's a classic small town secrets from the past murder mystery book. It's definitely more of a murder mystery than it is a thriller or suspense. I mean, it's a suspense mystery, but as we know, in the industry, we call everything a thriller, even when it's a mystery. So this was all the summer of 2019, percolating. I'd just finished the Ivies. My mom died. So fun. I was waiting for notes from my agent on the Ivies before I went on submission while I was percolating what's the next thing. I always try to have a next thing, even if I don't actively work on it. And I like had that brainwave of dead mom moving in with grandma, and I always know I could write a book when the first like line and then the second line and the first paragraph and the first page comes to me and I can write it. And I did that in July of 2019. I remember I was going to bed and it hit me. I pulled out my phone and I just swiped it, typed it real fast into a Google Doc. And that for the most part is the first couple pages. They're very similar to what I'd written that night. Then I went on a writing retreat in August of 2019 and we stayed in a Victorian mansion, a Queen Anne Victorian in Oregon. But that's when I was still percolating. I was like, well, her grandmother has to have a Queen Anne Victorian. I love these vibes. It had crystals in it and like sliding doors, and essentially the house in the book is the house that we stayed in. It was an epic Airbnb that is no longer available as an Airbnb, but I inserted those vibes, and that's when I was still figuring out the exact location. California, it actually came a little after I had figured out Cecelia gets to have a dead mom and move in with her grandmother. But I partly chose Northern California, not just for the Mendo vibes with Murder, She Wrote, but because there are a ton of Queen Anne Victorians in Northern California. Technically, it should have been more Northern California than I said it. I compromised by making up a town in a spot that was convenient to me. Sometimes authors have to take a little bit of latitude. Also, just because, fun fact, I wanted the small town to feel slightly isolated, and the thing about Northern California is it is. The nearest major airport is essentially the ones in the Bay Area near San Francisco. There are regional airports dotted up there, but you're not gonna get direct flights. They're all connecting, or you do really long drives. It's like 2 or 3 hours to that part of the coast from the Bay Area and the airports there, and even more if you're in other parts. And I wanted that slight isolation, but not too far. I wanted it to be roughly drivable for some plot reasons that came up later, but also because I wanted to feel like slightly claustrophobic, but not too claustrophobic, because I've never lived in an area that far out, so I did a little compromise. Where did the inspiration for the past murder plotline come from? I knew I wanted a murder mystery writer, but I didn't immediately know it was, oh, there was a murder in the town and she wrote a book about it. Though that kind of fit in with tropes that I love. And once I was like, oh, a homecoming queen and a copycat. I love those sorts of vibes. It's very like Fear Street from the 90s. But another piece of inspiration, and this is from years before. Again, long percolation process, and take your inspiration in over many years and you never know what's gonna come up. I watched a documentary on Netflix in 2017 called The Keepers, which was about a nun who died at a Catholic school in Maryland, as it so happens. But it had this like cold case, 1960s, like vibe, and that was my mother's era. That is when my mother went to high school, literally in Maryland as well. But there's something about the vibe of like a high school built in the 1950s. There's a certain like architectural charm, old schoolness to like, you know, the marble hallways and like the rows of lockers and like cinder block that like, I don't know, sparks something for me. And like, I there were shots of like, you know, the trophy case with memorial pictures, and like that just crystallized in my mind of like, that's a vibe I want. And it was always that first, like, you get like a mood spark, at least I do, when I'm thinking, what am I gonna write next? And for this one, I just pictured a girl standing in front of a trophy case in one of those long marble hallways with rows of lockers, like high school built in the 1950s, which is like in my mind, like that era of architecture, because I went to high school like that. Whatever's in the trophy case, like she's looking at something and it's like a cold case and it's someone who died. And that's kind of how that came together. So it's like all those vibes crashing, though I had to set it in 1970 because I'm older than a teenager. I know you're shocked. I had a boomer mom, I had an older mom, and I wanted to hearken to her era when she was a teenager, but I had to go a little more mid-boomer because I had to make it make sense that this 17-year-old girl would have, like, I had to figure out her mother's age and then work out her grandmother's age and make sure that her grandmother and her cohort would mostly be alive. It was quite the puzzle to figure out, like, how old are they? And kind of work that out. But yeah, in a nutshell, from 2017 to summer 2019, that was like the early beginnings of Pretty Dead Queens. I drafted about 10,000 words on that writing retreat, mostly vibes. It mostly got rewritten. We're gonna talk about it. But that was like the start. And then I put it on hold because we went on submission with the Ivies and I sold the Ivies and I had to edit it with my editor, but I had it in my back pocket as the book that I knew I wanted to submit as my option proposal. So we sold the Ivies, I edit it, and then we come to August 2020 when I'm starting to think about what am I gonna submit for my option material. We've done a one book deal for the Ivies and they had a first look at what I wanted to do next, my next YA contemporary mystery. So I dusted off what I had written the summer before, which brings me to the deep origins of Pretty Dead Queens. The original title, a whole original conceit and subplot that never ended up being written. And it was at this point coming back to it, I was like, I started throwing out what wasn't gonna work and I had to firm up the whole plot. I had to write a synopsis so that I could pitch it on proposal. And I started, you know, actually thinking, okay, what are my subplots? What is my cast? Originally, I called this book The Dead Moms Club because I did already know that in order to do my Maura Weston grandma plot reveal, I needed an A plot, a forward plot, a present plot, who killed the homecoming queen, and I landed on the whole frankly insane twist and motive I came up with for Ben, and I knew it was gonna be Ben, like from the word jump. Like I knew more or less who it had to be. And I thought, okay, what if there's a grief support group at the high school? And that's how I can kind of intersect these characters and pull them together. So originally, literally, she went to a grief support group at the high school run by Bronte, and Ben is a member, called the Dead Moms Club. And everything was gonna springboard off of that. And ultimately, you know, it was in that first chunk I wrote in summer of 2019, and coming back to it a year later in 2020, I was like, let's streamline and simplify. Because I was developing all the other stuff I wanted to do, and sometimes you have to go, this is too much. It's too many characters. That's always a risk. In something, I mean, in any book, but especially in a small town secrets thriller, you need just enough characters to kind of make the place feel vibrant, but not so many that you get really in the weeds of a million different characters. And even saying that, I probably have too many characters in Pretty Dead Queens, but that was already the streamlining because, you know, you need enough people in a club so that it actually feels like a club. And then you're like, wait, is this too many kids to have coincidentally lost parents at a young age? It's a whole thing. Another thing, just talking about the things that didn't end up in the book at all, in case you're curious, you know, as I was developing this proposal and selling it to my editor, I did have a scene very early on that I was really proud of. Cutting room floor, didn't end up in the book, of a city council meeting. And that's how I originally introduced the whole coastal erosion thing, because originally I had grand designs of politics playing a much larger role in this book, really getting into small town politics and kind of career politicians and, you know, the dark history of the town and all that kind of stuff. And so Ben and Cecelia went on a date to the city council meeting, and I had this whole thing where their history teacher gave them extra credit. I watched a city council meeting from a comparable coastal town in Northern California where they discussed coastal erosion. Guys, I went in deep, and I had so much fun writing that scene and like designing the characters and like making them feel like, you know, funny small town people, a little bit Stars Hollow-y almost, or Murder, She Wrote-y. All that ended up in the cutting room floor, though it wasn't the original proposal that I did. I submitted it to my editor, but even when we submitted it, we submitted 100 pages. It was with like the caveat like, I know you're gonna give me amazing notes and we're gonna change a lot of this. So talking a bit more about the bones of the book, and this is what really developed as I was submitting the proposal and selling it to my editor, because, you know, unsurprising plot twist, I sold this to my editor, obviously. It came out. Cecelia, this is very much a character-driven mystery. And it was really important to me from the jump. In general, I know I've talked about it on my channel. I've vlogged the process of writing this, so a lot of this isn't gonna be completely new to you. The spoiler parts are, because I never vlogged the secrets, but it was really important to me having come off of the Ivies and revising the Ivies as I was coming into August 2020 and figuring out what this book actually was, knowing the Ivies was my thriller debut. I very purposefully wanted Olivia and Cecelia to feel distinct from each other. This was important to me because something I worry about in myself is the pitfall of character archetypes and kind of falling into a comfort zone with character. Now we have things that we do a lot. In fairness, 8 times out of 10, I'm gonna write an anxious character, or I will write different characters who have aspects of anxiety because I'm a pretty anxious person. And in fairness, a lot of people have varying degrees of anxiety, so that's fine. And it works very well in thrillers because if you're an anxious person, well, aren't you just perfect to be thrown into a horrific, horrible murder scenario? But I didn't want Cecelia to be like Olivia. Olivia was a very specific, ambitious overachiever, very anxious, paranoid, which suits her well in the Ivies. There's a heightened level of, are my friends talking about me? And yes, they are, which only makes you more paranoid. And the themes that book was going into with friendship, that made sense. But I had written a thriller through that POV, and I didn't want to repeat myself. So from the very start, I tried to design Cecelia as not a lot like me. And it was an active challenge of, okay, I know how I would react to this, how I would be immediately suspicious of people being nice to me on my first day of high school, which says so much about me and it's pretty sad. But like, let's make Cecelia a little guileless. She thinks the best of people. She's a little self-deprecating, but within normal range. She is not reckless, but she's not fearful in the same way that Olivia is. So she makes very different choices in the investigation than Olivia did, which I tried to do to make it just feel fresh to anyone who read more than one of my books. And then when I eventually talk about The Bitter End, again, I set an additional challenge. I mean, I have 3 POVs in that one, 3 different characters. And again, it was like, okay, what have I already written? And how can I try to build off of that? You can't always be different. There are only so many character archetypes and only so many ways in which you can be comfortable writing characters, because we all have our own life experience to inform our writing. But that was one thing in the beginning that was really on purpose. And I'll tell you something funny about the writing process of Pretty Dead Queens and Cecelia. I designed her and I wrote her and I inserted her into this mystery, and I was petering along, and I got to like the 60% mark of actually drafting it. This is after, you know, rewriting Act 1, which we're going to talk about. And I had a panic moment. I got really close to the break into 3 because, you know, I'm thinking in my head like, okay, the break into 3, she's going to make a choice. It's going to propel her to the end and complete an arc. And I went, oh my God, I didn't give her a character arc. I'm a terrible person. And I just feel like such a dummy, because like within like 10 minutes of like beating myself up about utterly failing at Cecelia as a character, I was like, she's flat. Oh my God, she's flat. I realized she has a grief arc. Yeah, I'm a dum-dum. Sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. Cecelia definitely arcs. She doesn't like fundamentally change or improve, I should say, in ways that some characters might, but she absolutely learns something about the world and herself through her grief arc and like her hurting other people and how others hurt people. So that was a nice panic moment to have of like, I have failed as a writer. It worked out. Another thing I very purposefully did in writing Pretty Dead Queens, I mean, it's a completely different kind of book to the Ivies. It's a mystery more than it is a thriller, as I said, but also like, for me, there's a difference between kind of like a popcorn thriller where the fun is like, oh, they're all horrible people, and I love those books. I love writing those books. The bitter end is like my return to that after the Ivies, because I loved writing the Ivies too. But Pretty Dead Queens is very much my more kind of straight down the middle crossover mystery book. They're not all terrible people. And that was another concerted choice. Like I was like, they are not all gonna be terrible people. I'm gonna do a lot of awful things to this character. This is a spoiler talk, so you know. In the planning stages, I legit joked, but also genuinely felt bad and worried that I was just utterly ruining this character's life. I know she's not real, but I killed her mother. I made her only remaining family, only living relative, a psycho serial killer who dies. Her love interest, her boyfriend for all intents and purposes in the book, I also made him a psycho killer. So yeah, I gave her some friends. I gave her actual nice people in her life who were decent people, and that was very on purpose, kind of leaning more into a found family theme. But I did debate during the proposal process, you know, I included this in the proposal, and then after I sold it, I chatted with my editor and just snatched it out. So when I did submit the proposal, I gave her an aunt. I was like, I can't take away this girl's family and make her a sad orphan, because I'm an orphan now, but I have aunts and uncles. And I was like, I'm not even giving this poor fictional 17-year-old any family. I'm a terrible person. So she had an aunt, and I had this elaborate backstory that I still kind of love as an idea about how her mom was the scapegoat and the aunt who would have appeared at the end of the book to swoop in and adopt her was the golden child. I had a whole thing. But my editor, who I genuinely think as like the light to my dark, she's usually a fantastic balancing force for me, but sometimes she indulges my worst impulses, and I love her because she said, no, leave her with nothing. Other than her friends. It was actually her who articulated, it's found family, and that's okay. You don't need to have a magical aunt that you pull like a rabbit out of a hat at the very end of the book. And so that is why I ruined poor Cecilia's life, but also why I made a concerted effort. She's relatively normal. She's not dark and ambitious and self-destructive like Olivia, and she ends up with actual friends and connections. Also why I ultimately kind of built Suzanne as a support character. Originally I was like, is she like also a terrible person? But ultimately I was like, no, let's have some stability in this poor girl's life, something. And then lastly, before I get into the meat of actually drafting this thing and all the edits, this book went through a lot of edits. The last thing I kind of was constructing as I was working on the proposal and like the intent going into this book was making Seaview a character, because that's my favorite thing about small town mysteries. Like, and that's typically a cozy thing. I love cozies. Want to know all of the cozy mysteries I watch from BBC? I mean, on BritBox? Yes, I have a whole list. Was just rewatching Death in Paradise for like the 5th time yesterday. But I didn't want to write a cozy. I think of it more as an edgy cozy. It has cozy elements that I love from cozies, but I added some like slight gothic vibes and almost some noir at certain points. But by like the 3rd act, I wanted it to feel really gothic, like really dark and terrible, but it's like an amalgamation of those things. And so I developed Seaview and kind of what I wanted the town to feel like and look like. I ultimately decided on a fake town just to give me a little bit of wiggle room with things like I wanted to have a winery and I wanted it to have a Victorian hotel, but like, well, Victorian Edwardian hotel, but like, does the real town have it? I didn't want to be too constrained by that. Also because I'm literally creating a town where Maura Weston, my fake best-selling murder mystery writer has a fandom. So inventing a fake town really worked for me. And then building out the cast, it was really tricky because I knew I had to balance 2 murder mysteries set 50 years apart, and they had to have 2 full casts with characters with motives and enough red herrings in both eras, but also that intersected. And some of that I did ahead of time, and some of that I figured out while I was writing. So we're gonna jump into how the heck did I write this book. I did vlog it at least. So I already teased that much of the first act, which is actually 14,000 words, not about 10,000 words. It was 14,000 words I wrote in 2019 and then polished for proposal in August of 2020 and submitted that fall. A lot of that got thrown out and I rewrote a lot of it. If you watched me when I vlogged this, I did something insane writing this book that I then also did to some degree on the bitter end. You level up your skills and you do things that scare you and it works out. When I was a much more novice writer, especially before I was published, but even my first couple books, I couldn't stop my momentum as I was drafting and go back and edit. It would derail me from a book. But on this one, I got into Act 2 after selling on proposal, and I knew it was bothering me so much, things from the proposal that I knew I was throwing out, and I was itching to go back and rewrite Act 1. So I did. And it's easier to talk about what survived versus what didn't if you read the book. The first chapter, the skeleton stayed intact, though my editor had some brilliant suggestions and dev, which we'll talk about, that made chapter 1 so much better. But the skeleton there stayed. Same with chapter 2, like a driving tour of the city and coming to school and her first day of school, that stayed. I mentioned homecoming, but there was no actual like scene. So all of that stuff with like the cafeteria and voting for the theme and the pool and all of that ended up coming in later when I revised it. And another major thing was Caleb, who is still in the book, I saved his life, was originally in the core friend group, but it was too many characters. And my editor did make the note after I'd sold on proposal, as I was continuing to draft, she said, like, bear in mind as you continue to draft and then you turn in a first draft to me. She wanted me to really cut down the cast. Honestly, she had asked about me getting rid of Morgan and compressing her with another character. And I did fight for that because what I decided, my rule of thumb, and hopefully this helps some of you writing mysteries, I drilled it down to, okay, who has a motive for murder and therefore can satisfy a red herring and or their red herring plot, their B or C or D plot actively contributes to the suspense progression and the investigation thread. If they had something that I already knew I wanted to do that the plot hinged on, I wasn't gonna cut them. So poor Caleb did not have a motive for murder and did not contribute to the mystery in any substantive way. So he became a background character who I was still able to use because my headcanon when he was part of the main friend group was that he was hooking up with Luke. So I wanted to keep that, but that was, you know, a slight change. So I already told you about the city council meeting date that died horribly when I went back to revise Act 1. Another thing I wrote that the party. You know, I love parties. I love parties so much. I love parties in mansions especially, and I love that scene in a book. I have one in the Ivies, so you know I love that scene in a book. And you might be going, she has a party in Pretty Dead Queens. Yes, but originally the party I had, so it was a pacing thing. Now, admittedly, I purposefully have the murder be the break into 2. Sometimes a murder is an inciting incident, and sometimes it's a break into 2. In the Ivies, it's not quite the inciting incident, but it's not the break into 2 either. It's kind of between those 2 points. It's pretty much, it's very close after the inciting incident. But in this one, it's more of a mystery arc, and you can kind of like, there's like a vibe and a flow and different pacing that'll work ideally for different kinds of books. And because I was doing small town mystery, small town secrets, as well as the secrets of the past thing, I knew I needed a lot of setup. I wanted it to feel tense and still be a page turner, but readers who like this kind of book are, including me, I love these kinds of books, are slightly more accepting of slower pacing as long as there's still, you have character stuff and you basically use tone and genre and teasing and almost like a meta level to keep people reading. And some of that I had in the drafting phase, and some of it I put in editing, because it's okay. Sometimes you don't quite hit it out of the park on the first draft, but you know that it needs to be there, of like almost winking things to the audience, because we all know a murder's coming because it is a murder mystery. But part of the fun of reading it is like, well, I'm meeting this cast and I'm getting all of this, like these like scenes that are hinting at backstories. Who's it gonna be and who's the killer? And you're looking for things, and you get kind of tension and propelling a reader through a story from that. It's a sleight of hand kind of thing. I was doing that, and I knew I was doing that because I knew that Natalie was gonna die as a break into 2. Her murder would propel us into Act 2. But accordingly, that first 100 pages that I sent to my editor on proposal, she didn't die. I knew I had a pacing problem. Like, I knew I had to fix it. I knew I had to do something to get us to the murder faster while still having it be the break into 2. And one of the problems was the party. A party at Natalie's house, RIP. I had so much fun writing this set piece, and I'll also say about process. I don't think of this as wasted time. I know that a lot of people are like, well, if she outlined this, would it happen? And I just don't think so, especially because I'm more of a plantser. A lot of times on the very nascent versions of the books, whether it's kind of the first act as I'm figuring out a proposal or like drafting, I tend to get like halfway through a draft and I know exactly what I need to do in Act 1, and that's part of my process. I know what I already have. But writing it helps me learn my characters and my dynamics and what I'm playing with. And I loved writing a house party at Natalie's house. It was a pre-homecoming party at Natalie's house. And oh, you know, I love to describe mansions and like teenagers being awful and drama and like underage drinking, which I don't condone. It's bad. So I had this scene, and it was over 2 chapters, and it had a lot of beats, including beats, at least 2, that were essential to the mystery. And I held on to them. I was like, Elizabeth, I love this party. We can't cut it. And she gave me the note over and over again. She gave it to me after she bought it on proposal. She gave it to me when I didn't delete it and kept it in my first draft, which I sent to her in 2 pieces because I keep doing that and she indulges me. I kept it after doing a first edit past 2. I was so stubborn. But it took me time to drill down to why I felt attached to it and what I wanted to keep, and I figured out where to move them to other parts of the book, which we're gonna talk about. So my goal was, sold it on proposal. I had a preliminary notes from her based on the proposal in the first 100 pages, but I wanted to draft through, but I got to the halfway mark. I got to write literally the midpoint, and also, this is one book where I didn't know the midpoint before I started it. I knew the midpoint in the Ivies. I did not know the midpoint of Pretty Dead Queens. You know, sometimes we have to live dangerously, and I figured it out. I got to that point. So the whole Natalie's mom being a therapist and her eavesdropping on her sessions to blackmail people, that was I figured that out while I was drafting. And it's one of my favorite revelations I've had. I knew I wanted her to kind of have a power play with people. I knew I wanted her to be that kind of queen bee, you know, like a power broker type of queen bee, you know, after her politician father. I wanted something like that, but I hadn't figured out the mechanics. And when I figured out the mechanics of how fun that midpoint turn would be, and her figuring that out and starting to lay up the domino, but that is also when I was like, it's really bothering me that my Act 1 is a mess. I can't hand this to someone like a friend or a beta and have them read from the beginning to this midpoint to tell me how it's working, because I know Act 1 doesn't work. So I went insane and I stopped drafting and I went back to the beginning. So as I said, like chapter 1 and 2, the skeleton stayed the same. And from there, I threw almost everything out. I like gutted that section of the book. I had filler of like the girls going shopping for homecoming outfits, for theme week, for homecoming theme week, and working on a float, like stuff that like going to the diner and like running into some of Maura's fans. Like I had all of this stuff that certainly like eventually helped me as being like deep backstory for the character in the world. It's all useful. Threw it out. Pacing wasn't right. I changed the city council date I threw that out and I changed it to Ben and Cecelia going on a date to, I did a movie on the green where they watched Killer Queen. That went into this revision, but eventually got thrown out because you're like, that's not in the book, right? But this was the revision where I added an actual murder tour. And that was from a comment from my editor, because I mentioned it, that this was like a side business. She was like, could we actually go on that tour? And I went, yeah. And that's, you know, the thing is, anytime you have something, I mean, in any book, but especially in a thriller, that's taking up space, a set piece, as I call it, it has to serve a function to the mystery ultimately. It has to build character, or connect characters, or support a motive or a red herring or something. And the best set pieces are like active and engaging, but are secretly feeding people deep backstory without it feeling like an info dump. So originally my idea, I just thought it would be really funny if this town had a walking murder tour, and that was how Luke and Caleb made money, just because they were kind of morbid people. Also because I would love to go on one of those things. Oh, another thing, if you picked up the Vibes Scream, which is also set in this region of California, 100% was a Vibes inspiration for the book. I hope you pictured that while you were reading. But Caleb had been shunted to the second string as a character. So I was like, why not have this serve a much better character and plot function? And that's how Ben became his business partner. Ben wasn't part of the friend group before at any time. And that's what kind of unpacked this much stronger idea, I think, ultimately for the book, of him being in the group at one point, but Natalie is essentially ousting him because they were hooking, and like adding all of those complications and having there like be a divide of like, well, we don't dislike Ben, but we can't publicly be friends with him, and adding a little bit of that textural detail. And it was so fun writing the murder tour. Now originally on this version, so this is still my first draft, I had dueling murder tours. I had 2 murder tours because I spun from there of like, okay, so what if they have one murder tour and they're raking in dough? What if Gabriel, who, I love Gabriel, he started out just as like a stock hot younger brother football player and evolved. Not all of it got like stuck in the book, but I hope there are enough hints of it so that, you know, like I turned him into like this cute little nerd. I was like, what if Gabriel's a huge history buff and he hates Luke and Ben's murder tour because it's sensationalist, and it's also really about Maura and her books. Not that he doesn't like Maura's books, but he's like more of a nerd, and he's like, our town has history from the gold rush and like and the logging industry and all this kind of stuff. So he has a alternate murder tour, his own like historical murder tour to make money. I liked that idea, especially because Bronte and Gabriel aren't as rich as Luke, and Ben's kind of not rich, but Luke is definitely rich. And I also wanted to add that texture of like resentment of like the rich kid has the tour and makes bank and he doesn't even need the money. So originally she goes on the tour and they run into Gabriel's tour and there's like conflict, and it was at the bookstore. I did enjoy that. Later we streamlined that, but that was the original edit. And also from there came the idea for a housewarming party for Cecelia at Maura's house. I think I came up with the idea, but it sparked off of something my editor said about laying threads for the massive ass cast that I had. Because I had all of this, like I was doing stuff, but a lot of the older cast was introduced at the city council meeting, and since I was throwing it out, I knew that I still had to kind of like work in some of those politics and relationships. So that's where the housewarming party came from. And so I wrote that. So then there were 2 parties because I was keeping Natalie's party in. And I had a scene in that party where she gets really emotional and she goes upstairs for some alone time and stumbles into her mother's childhood bedroom and gets upset and goes to the kitchen and has a moment with Gabriel. And I did have the fight. So like the housewarming party ended up pretty intact, except we ended up moving that sequence of her going upstairs and finding her mom's childhood bedroom to chapter 1. So that was one of my editor's really smart edit suggestions to kind of, for the character arc and the grief arc and the setup, to move that, transpose it somewhere else. Very smart. So I added and rewrote all of this stuff, but each set piece is a lot more active. The murder tour is active. It sets up the pool reenactment thing, which was originally somewhere else. It was right before the party that died, Natalie's party that died, because I wanted to set up that Morgan dyed her hair, so she and Natalie were brunettes, and so it's all dominoes, but I wrote a bunch of new set pieces, I edited them, and ultimately, even though I added a ton of stuff, and even though I was stubbornly keeping Natalie's party, I got the murder into the first 30K. And I was so proud of myself. So that's basically the work I did so that I could go back to the middle of Act 2 and keep drafting. This book was really chaotic. But like, I enjoyed it. I mean, I didn't, but I did. Now, before I went back to fix Act 1 because it was bothering me, I had written the first thing I started writing after I sold on Proposal. I'd like hinted at the fan con, but I really started writing that. So I wrote that and started figuring out, you know, Amber's dad being the sheriff and how that would dovetail. So I'd written all of that. And you know, there's always certain things I do on the fly, and I was like, okay, I don't just want her to go to this fan con. There has to be something that she discovers there. And so that's when you end up with surveillance footage. I was like, what does she see on their surveillance footage? And you're like, you're a mess, it's fine. And I was like, okay, Suzanne. And that's how I kind of figured out that Mira was an FBI agent, because originally I just had, because I come from fandom and I love fandom and I love fan cons, and so there are bits of their fan con that's directly inspired by me working on fan cons. They were just a fun cast of fanish characters because I wanted to play the was it a fan copycat angle. But they were just there at first. So as I kind of went back through Act 1 and was writing, it was developing who they actually were and giving them texture. And I should say, because we know that these videos jump all over the place, all of this drafting was happening like December, January, February into March of 2020 into 2021. So it was that spring time. My deadline was in April, and spoiler that you won't be shocked by, I did not turn in my book in April. We're gonna get there. And the reason for the gaps is, you know, I had to pause every time to work on the Ivies. So like I got line edits and copy edits and past pages kind of in that fall timeline while my editor was reviewing my proposal, so I wasn't working on it until I'd sold it. So this stopping to revise Act 1 and kind of threading through Act 2, getting up to the point where I had stopped, took me about 3 weeks. So pretty fast. I fixed the majority of the things that were bothering me so that I could read it from start to where I'd left off, or hand it to someone else from start to where I'd left off, and it could feel cohesive and do what I knew that I needed it to start doing. And accordingly, I checked in with my editor. I was like, hey, I lost my mind, and decided to do a dev edit of Act 1 based on what we'd already talked about and what I've ended up doing in Act 2. Will you read it? So I did send her that first 30K where I got to the murder. Yay, because when she'd read the proposal, I hadn't gotten to the murder, and I was so proud of actually writing the murder and then fixing the stuff before it to get it in the first 30K that I wanted her feedback. So I sent that to her while I went back to the middle to push into the third act and hopefully finish this book. Still pie in the sky, thinking, April deadline, I can do it. My editor read in about 2 weeks. She read the first 30K in about 2 weeks, and she gave me some like light notes, overall letting me know that it worked, but reminding me again, she really thought I needed to cut the sequence, the party at Natalie's house. But she didn't want to derail my writing process, so very light dev notes on that first 30K. So it took me until June to actually finish the complete draft, which all told was, I think it was 85,000 words. It was in that, or maybe 80,000 words. It was in that ballpark. And unlike some of my books, it actually included an ending. I sent her a book that had an ending, which I don't always do. Now I threw out the majority of that ending, and it's not the ending you read in the book, but sometimes you have to write something wrong, get feedback from your editor in order to write it right. Cause I wrote it one way, cause this whole time I was debating, I knew what I was writing toward. I didn't know what I wanted to do with Mora. I didn't know if I wanted to kill her or not. I could see it going either way. I could see her surviving her fall and ending up in jail and having something that way, or I could just see killing her. And the first draft that I sent to my editor, I didn't kill her, and I actually did have like a confrontation, like a moment in the hospital happen. So that is what I actually sent to my editor. So yeah, one of the big notes I got from her and Dev was, let's kill her. Which, again, she helps me feed into my worst impulses. I love it. Or maybe they're my best impulses. So you might have noticed something I haven't talked about is the whole past timeline, the whole past murder thing. When were you writing this? I figured that out, a lot of it out, as I went, as I was drafting. So again, you can go back and watch my vlogs. A huge part of Act 2 is always hard, but a huge part of why it was especially hard in this book. So Act 1, like kind of the build up to Natalie's murder, the whole point is Natalie's murder. It's very present focused, as are the fun and games at the beginning of Act 2. It's all about Natalie, because they're still kind of, the threads are very tenuous of, is this a copycat? Especially because the first red herring is it a crazy fan? And kind of exploring that. But once I get into the middle and the back half of Act 2, I had to actually like figure out those threads of the 50-plus-year-old mystery. So it was really as I was getting into the back half of Act 2 after I'd revised Act 1, so at that point it's like March, that I had to really start bringing it all together. I had planted the seeds, you know, I had the housewarming party at Mara's house. I knew who I call them the boomers, the boomer generation, the older generation, the past gen, connected to that murder mystery. I'd introduced them and they were in the book, but I get to the back half of 2 and it's like, I have to actually thread these things together. As I was writing, I was figuring out certain things, including cutting Suzanne's brakes in her car and having her get into an accident. That was a drafting decision, like in the moment, and I'm so glad I did it. And also just figuring out, obviously I knew Maura killed Caroline. I didn't quite know how, but I was kind of puzzling it out, and as I was getting into the second act, I was like, you know, you're actually gonna have to make some decisions about these things, because I drafted the breaking into the police archive scene because I love that trope. I love that moment in a small town thing, but it's also the secrets from the past type of mystery, cold case type of mystery, where someone finds like the digitized file didn't have this original handwritten note from the original detective. I love that kind of thing. And that's when I was like, okay, I need something for her to find. What is she gonna find in the records? And I was constantly stopping, but this is part of my process, and doing, I call them question lists, and I know I talked about it when I was actually blogging this book, because I did it with the Ivies too, but I did it even more in Pretty Dead Queens. Anytime I'd get stuck, because I'm a headlights writer, I can see a little bit ahead, I would work backwards from what I knew I needed to happen. I need her to find something in the files because I love that moment. It's a great way to reveal a clue, and it's very much part of the genre. What does she find? And then it's like, okay, how did Caroline die? And I'd already presented it one way. I had presented it as she was strangled and drowned in the pool. And I knew I'd presented it that way, and I had this worry in my head of like, you kind of did the same thing in the Ivies. That's the reason there's no water-related death or pool-related death in the bitter end. Can you tell I'm afraid of water? Yeah, anyway. So you can't always repeat yourself, but that is where it came from of, okay, well, thinking it out. It takes a lot to strangle a person, so what if she didn't strangle her? What if that was part of the staging, because she's a criminal mastermind? We stand a queen who uses it for her material in her books. And so it was kind of piecing together. That's where I came up with the insulin, and then like piggybacking off of that, and you know, jumping back into Act 1 as I'm drafting before I send things to my editor, and inserting a clue to support the thing I came up with while I was drafting Act 2. And it was when I was in that middle, I knew Mara did it. I knew that the guy who went to prison didn't do it. And I knew that I had to have compelling alternate suspects from 1970, from the original timeline. And so as I was actually in Act 2, I did I did my question lists of like, okay, so who, like, I would ask myself questions. So if this, then that. What if, and thinking about the cast I had. And it was then that I was like, because I wrote a scene, I was like, you have a school secretary, administrative assistant, who knows Maura, who is her age, and I had just had them do small talk when I originally wrote chapter 2, just to characterize Maura. I added like a little bit of patter there for her, and also just because logistically, often when you start at a new school, someone from the office walks you to your first class and gives you your schedule. But I realized, duh, I've crafted a character who I can actually use in a much more interesting way. And as I was writing the back half of Act 2, I was figuring out how to come up with a strong alternate theory of both the original murder that could also work for Natalie's murder, even though I knew they didn't do it. And it was that kind of work. I was doing that as I was drafting Act 2, actively doing it. And honestly, I ended up liking it so much. I wasn't gonna change the ending of my book, but I was really happy with it and proud of like, this would have been a very strong alternate solution. It could have been Grace the whole time and I would completely buy it, because I love the trope of like sins of the past, of like someone punishing the grandchildren of people who had done them wrong. I do like that idea. It's a little bit unhinged in the best possible way. So I was doing that work while I was drafting, and so I was writing every day, almost every day, but I would pause every so often, and this is just part of my headlights writing process, to look ahead. All right, what are the next few scenes I'm writing? What are the breadcrumbs and the dominoes? What have I established versus what can I do here? And it included every so often jumping backwards to insert something that I'd come up with. So that was how the process worked. And that's, yeah, I came up with the breaking into the police archives to find that little tidbit was in there, but things that were in this draft that changed later. I had a whole little thing, because I love that scene in the movie, in the book, where you go to the newspaper archives or the library and you look at microfiche. I love that. I love it. It's such a trope. I did have that, and it did get cut later. I did have a scene where they went through the microfiche at the newspaper archives with Gabriel to find other tidbits that were useful. I ended up moving them, but we'll put a pin in that because that was one of my editor's notes that I ended up doing in developmental edits, but giving you an idea of kind of what changed in Act 2. It was also as I was writing this that I fully was grappling with, okay, this whole fabulous political subplot that you had in your like general brain in 2019, now in 2021 just isn't happening. It wasn't organically unfolding with the characters in the town, mostly because I was doing a lot and I was like, I could do it, but that would be even more. I compromised and I added like a micro thing with Natalie's dad. I wanted something with Natalie's dad as the mayor, something corrupt. And that's where it also worked out that I'd already introduced a character who worked at the Maura Fan Con. And the great thing about a small town is it makes sense that people do double duty in different roles. And so it worked out to have her working for Natalie's dad and like have something there. So it was all tumbling downhill. Third act, I was writing toward the third act the whole time. Second acts are generally the hardest because I tend to have fewer fully formed thoughts of what they need to be in my head, which I actually think makes me a little more nimble and dynamic in drafting and editing, which can be good. Third act, I wrote very fast because I wrote the entire book because I had in my brain from the very beginning 2 set pieces. The dilapidated house, half falling off a cliff, murder chase with the boyfriend. The boyfriend did it trope. I wanted to write it. And I wanted it to be the one that was like, I had just enough red herrings to play with people, but if you guessed it, you were kind of supposed to. I leaned hard into that trope. And for a time there, I wanted to be like, it could be either of the love interests because I'm doing this trope. But I obviously knew it was Ben, but I wanted that scene. As soon as she left homecoming with him, I wanted everyone to be like, girl, you're stupid. You made the wrong choice. He did it. Because as a reader, I love that turn. I love that moment. So I mean, I adored writing that part of the book. The actual action scene part of it is hard because I find action scenes hard. You're always like, okay, you know, how can I write the physical motion and the emotional reactions and not have them be repetitive and keep the tension up? Like, that part was definitely hard, but like the actual set piece, I was looking forward to it. And if you caught this, yes, it was partially inspired by that old Ryan Gosling, Sandra Bullock movie, Murder by Numbers. I've always loved that confrontation at the end of that movie. It's so creepy, and there were definitely vibes there. And then the other thing that was just always in my head, from the moment I wrote those first chapters on that writing retreat and decided her grandmother lived in a Victorian mansion, I had also recently, around the time of brainstorming all this, I had read Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. It had a dumbwaiter subplot. There are other books that have them too. I love that gothic trope so much. We love a dumbwaiter. And as soon as I decided there was a dumbwaiter, I knew I was going to push someone down it. And I knew that there would be the chase in the Victorian mansion. She'd come home after finding out that her boyfriend was a psycho killer, and she would think she was safe for 2.5 seconds, and it would be her grandmother. I had so much fun writing it, I can't even tell you. I had so... Especially because it's like I finally got to write a villain monologue for my Murder, She Wrote serial killer. And as I was drafting, but even more in editing, just like laying those clues, why yes, almost all of the deaths mentioned on the murder tour, Maura was responsible for. Not all of them, but most of them. Why yes, when Elaine says that her brothers died and that's the only reason she inherited the Seaview Hotel. Why yes, Maura did that. We love her. We love her. And I have my whole headcanon about like her murdering a publicist. Like, the book meta. The book meta. So that was the first draft that I turned into her. It was basically like rewrote Act 1 as I was working, had to figure a ton out as I was drafting Act 2, and then breezed through Act 3. I had so much fun writing it, but with an ending that I ended up throwing out completely because the question mark was whether Maura lived or died. So we picked death. So it's June 2021. I have turned in a complete draft of Pretty Dead Queens, which at this point was still called Murder, She Texted. I did not sell it as the Dead Moms Club. I sold it as Murder, She Texted, and that's what I called it for a very long time. And briefly, the reason we changed the title, and it was that summer that we did, because I had a complete, I finished the book, I wrote the book, and it had been bothering me the whole time I was drafting, especially once I got into the weeds of Act 2, that the tone and vibe of the book that I was actually writing just didn't fit the title, which honestly worked out. Like, I had wanted to write a very like edgy, cozy. I didn't actually want it to be cozy. I wanted it to be pretty dark and edgy with some gothic vibes. And Murder, She Texted doesn't fit that vibe. So I've turned in my book. My editor is reading it. I also, in this time, in that spring, I gave the manuscript to a friend of mine, Lexi, who is from the area where I set the book. So I get my editor's notes and Lexi's notes and a couple of other beta readers, and I go into my dev pass of the book. It's technically my second because I'd already rewritten Act 1 once. And we're back. My battery died, so the lighting positioning might look a little different. I actually think the lighting might be better now that it's been about an hour, but it was the perfect act break between I turned in my book and all the rest of the edits. Let's try to wrap this up.
And to make a long story short,
so I get my editor's notes really fast, like 3 weeks after I sent them to her. It's like June 2021, June 23rd, 2021. She sends me her notes for the whole book. And just like the Ivies, and as we also ended up doing on the bitter end, my editor likes to combine dev and line. I always get a letter, very top line, that kind of talks about what she likes and then the things that she kind of identifies that she would like to work on. But she also has gone meticulously through the manuscript. She usually apparently goes through it like 2 or 3 times, always ends up reading my books more than I have, and does the line level stuff as well. So that's looking at repetition, some continuity, like tightening in certain sections, like making things clear, etc. So on this book, it ended up working because the majority of the edits, the intensity of the dev was in the first half of the book, really more like the first 2/3. And as I started getting into it, I realized, like, timing wise, to hit our deadline to go to copy edits and stay on the schedule for fall 2022, which was already later than I ideally would have liked. When I first sold the book, it was like, well, you can write it in 6 weeks and it can come out in spring 2022, or you can have a couple months, which I knew I needed, and it's fall 2022. I didn't want to miss it. Ironically, that's exactly what ended up happening with The Bitter End, but I digress. I wanted to hit my deadline as well as humanly possible. So we ended up splitting it into 2. I like hustled really hard and I got her the first, like, a little more than half of the book on July 23rd, 2021. So 1 month to kind of get all of that done. And while she read that and gave me more notes on that, I finished the rest of the book and we kind of tag team back and forth. I think we did that on the Ivies and we did it on this one, and we also did that on The Bitter End. So a pattern with our kind of working style. So this was the pass where that murder tour went from a dueling murder tour to a solo murder tour, because she got the version where it was like Gabriel and Ben and Luke had tours and they got into a conflict. It got streamlined on this dev pass per her notes, which helped with pacing and everything to make it one. And instead of multiple stops, it was like kind of like a transitional skip getting us to the high school for that big moment at the end. This was also her suggestion to take the pool demonstration scene, which was originally the next day after school, and have it officially be part of the tour. I had written and included the homecoming theme vote cafeteria sequence and also the pool prank sequence when I had revised Act 1 before turning in my first draft, but they both got serious refinement on this pass. Streamlining, refinement, kind of getting, because I needed to get in stuff about Ben and his relationships with the different characters and his backstory into that section. It was also at this time that she read the housewarming party sequence and suggested I move Cecelia looking at her mother's childhood bedroom to chapter 1. So that's when we did a series of small refinements to that beginning of the book. It was editing that in and kind of changing the emotional arc in the first chapter a bit, definitely making it a lot better. That's also where I added stuff about her looking through the old yearbooks in Mara's office. And I ended up really streamlining. I just made all these like little tweaks, really drilling in on tension, character building, and like clues essentially. This was the pass where I threw out Ben and Cecelia going on a date on the page for final. In that first one, it was the city council date, and then I made it a movie night. So I wrote it one way when I rewrote Act 1, then I wrote it another way. I edited it again as I was reading through the whole manuscript before I sent my editor the first draft to try to like fine tune like the mechanics of it and how it would fit with the pacing. And then after turning it into her, I cut it completely, because essentially it was always tightening and pacing in Act 1, really critical in this book. So it was better to cut it. And finally, I got the note again, I think it was the 3rd time, that I needed to cut Natalie's party. R.I.P. Natalie's party. So I had finally accepted it. You know, sometimes you just need a little bit of time, honestly. You need to be sitting with a story and working on a story to let go of the things that you're really attached to, but you're getting notes on them repeatedly. And so I accepted that it was finally time, and I drilled down to why I was attached to it in the first place. This is what I recommend doing. First of all, I like a little scenery setting and chewing. I loved the description of the house. I love how it brought up, just like as a little textural detail, that even though you aren't supposed to have private beaches in California, that they had one, just to like to characterize Natalie and her family and their position in the town. There is a clue, like a direct actual foreshadowing clue to Ben and Natalie's relationship in the scene when they are in her bedroom. And this might sound slightly familiar because you're like, wait, that's in the book. This was part of the compromise. But originally the arc of the party, so go to the party, people are drinking. It was to just characterize the friend group and their different personalities. This is when I was still kind of juggling a larger friend group and working out their dynamics. And eventually there was a bonfire on the beach scene. I love a good bonfire on the beach scene with more drinking, and essentially that Ben came to the party even though he wasn't really welcome, and it was supposed to show a lot of the tension in the relationship, that those little bits and pieces were transposed essentially to the school stuff later. And he gets a little drunk and gets really upset with Cecelia when she says that she's going to go to therapy and see her mother, to see Natalie's mother. And the original idea of that was I needed that little hint clue of like, he has a legitimate reason to tell her not to go because he knows that Natalie records therapy sessions. He knows that Natalie's terrible. But also just like, I wanted him to have an explosion of anger at her relationship with getting, like, jealousy with getting close to Natalie, and like it kind of interfering with his plans and his territory. I wanted it to be that flash, because I don't like it when a character turns out to be, you know, whatever they turn out to be, and there are no hints whatsoever before that they contain this. I think you have to have subtle characterization, but ultimately I did realize me having him get angry with her at the bonfire when he's drunk was not actually subtle at all. So, I mean, it needed to change for a lot of reasons, but it was like, those were the beats that I wanted. Essentially, that sequence contained combo character and mystery beats that were wrapped up in each other that I liked. And that's why I held on to it for so long. I think also because I do just like the set dressing. So the compromise was little bits of the beats I wanted to keep, I moved to other places, including Ben and Cecelia do fight about her going to therapy. It's in a different place, so you can still get like that little hint, that little clue. And I shifted it to him directly being jealous of Gabriel, because that was also important to me to show that he's capable of like a little flash, like a mask off kind of moment. And that's why I have them run to Natalie's beach house before they go to the homecoming game, because I still wanted to have that little clue about Ben and Natalie's relationship. But I also didn't want to lose an opportunity, because the party scene had originally been one of the few times, other than at Natalie's house after her therapy session with her mother, one of the few times that they had one-on-one character interaction. And I ended up in the revision while keeping it but changing it completely. I used it as an opportunity to actually like texturize Natalie as a person a little bit and their relationship a little bit. And then they go to the homecoming game, and that was another part of this revision. It was losing the party, but getting some more like breadcrumby type things into that sequence of the book before the murder. And my editor helped me flesh out, actually, it was in the first draft, but on the revision we fine-tuned it even more. Cecelia going to the homecoming game, and like there being the fight between Natalie and Morgan, and that kind of, it's the reason we find out later that Morgan messed with her dress, which they find later. So like all of that was firmed up between the first draft and this first dev pass revision. So another thing I generally did on this pass is what I call my famous bitch edit, which I had to do on Avery. I did it in Brightly Burning on an antagonist character, because when I'm drafting, I go full conflict. Whoever the character is, I just always love a fabulous, fierce woman, and sometimes they're like, you hate to love them, and sometimes they're designed just to, you know, Natalie's pretty awful. She ends up being the victim, so she was that archetype in this book, but like hearts to Avery, and you'll quickly figure out one of my favorite characters at the bitter end. As you read it, you'll be like, oh, she had fun with this character. But I always do a first pass where I go hard. I have so much fun going hard. They say the zingiest, sometimes nastiest, cattiest things. I enjoy it a lot, and I always have to temper them. I do the bitch edit, which is always just giving them actual dimension, so they feel a tiny bit more like a real person, even if they're also 100% an archetype and they're like something that's fun. I try to texturize them a little bit and temper them and make sure that they gel with other characters a little better. That was definitely something I did with Natalie on this dev edit pass, including that like scene at her house and like having them actually like talk, like a little bit of vulnerability come through and kind of make her feel a bit more real. And I actually did a similar thing to the sheriff, to Amber's dad, less so a bitch edit and more a who is this character and who do I actually want them to be? Like, not a major character, but you know, I'd written law enforcement into the Ivies and I didn't want to repeat myself and write the exact same character again, but also I always want to be like mindful. Like, there are all sorts of different kind of law enforcement characters you can have in a murder mystery, and I wasn't sure what I wanted him to be as I'd written the various drafts. Like, he started off more as like Amber's dad and kind of a good guy, but I worried he was a little bit too close to the character in the Ivies in terms of how he interacted with Cecelia. And then I kind of like, I made him a lot more antagonistic on the first draft, and some of that stayed, but part of the dev edit was drilling down to, so I have some of these conflict scenes with him that I enjoy. I think they do a lot for the book. It's one of the ones that I had added in completing the first draft before this dev pass was originally Cecelia takes a picture in the police station of their murder board, which she still does, but originally after that, Amber, and Bronte just go to Bronte's house and sit and look at pictures to deduce clues, and Amber tells them stuff that she knows. And that included a picture of the homecoming dress from Natalie's locker as a clue. And my editor was like, this is passive. I hate it. Like, she didn't say I hate it, but she said, this is very passive. The scene is not working. You have to fix this. It was in the fun and games section. And then it turned into the more active scene of them actually going to the school and finding that themselves. And then Amber's dad comes and he's really annoyed that they've interfered with the crime scene inadvertently. So I made it a lot more active, and I kind of had him rub against Cecelia some more. And so then in that edit and this dev edit, it was refining him running into her in the diner and figuring out kind of what his deal was. And he was maybe a little too antagonistic after the first draft. So in this dev pass, I definitely refined kind of what I thought. And I was like, I think he can be different things to different people. Amber will definitely have one perspective on him as her dad. And then, you know, Gabriel will definitely have a different opinion about him as a kid that gets picked on for various reasons. And I kind of settled on, I think he's like divorced dad who's probably a high functioning alcoholic. So that refinement, even though it's a minor side character, I kind of did that in this pass. So further changes to Act 2, I had mentioned the police archives and going to the newspaper archives, double archives, little too repetitive. And also generally my editor was very wary of passive investigation. And I definitely had a compromise with her there. I pointed out, like, there are certain tropes and ways to get information that, yes, feel very passive, but they're literally how it works in a lot of cases. Like, there's 2 instances of looking up surveillance footage in this book, and she really wanted me to cut one of them. And I made a case for it where I was like, this is often how you can get information nowadays. There are cameras everywhere. I tried to make them slightly different enough, but I was like, please. She also was really wary of anything seeming too easy, too passive for Cecelia in terms of getting information, but I had to make the case for 1 or 2 things of she's an amateur detective, and it can get really ridiculous if you make someone too good at amateur detecting a murder. And so one thing that she had wanted me to cut, I said, could I keep that? Because it's just very teen sleuth. Was her sneaking into the library to listen in on student interviews. Like, it's technically convenient, but she has to be clever enough to do it, and it's believable that an amateur, like a 17-year-old, this is the way that they get information. Just like I think it's believable that, you know, Amber works at the station and she gets her into the police archives. Like, you get one where the daughter of the sheriff helps out, but that's also such a thing in a small town murder mystery where everyone knows everyone, and like, that's why you make your main character so often like a journalist or one of those sorts of characters where their job is knowing people. And when it's an amateur teen, you kind of have to like use similar methods. I mean, It's kind of that trope from Veronica Mars of her still having contacts at the sheriff's office who conveniently help her out with stuff. So there's kind of a balance there. But the microfiche at the newspaper office was like one beat too many that was slightly similar. And so on this dev pass, that's when I changed it to the Seaview Museum, just as a different way to communicate deep backstory about her grandmother and that generation and Caroline's murder. Just something slightly interactive, and I ended up really loving it because it's a little more quirky. It's a little more small town. It gave me the opportunity for her to run into Rima and kind of play off of that. And I decided, because it's my town and I can do what I want to, I was like, and it's the mayor's office, sure. And I was able to kind of combine all those things, and it was this dev pass where I did all of that work. Like, it was things that were happening, they just happen in slightly different places. Like, it's just transposing the way in which the information kind of was communicated and unfolded. To that end, another change I made in dev, in the first draft, I had them kind of doing a small caper of breaking into the office during an assembly during the day to look at that school surveillance footage and realizing what wasn't on the cameras at school and figuring out who defaced the dress and all that kind of stuff. And it was fine, but my editor was like, why don't they break in at night? And at first I was like, oh God, I have to write another action sequence. But she really sold me on the case for it. It was a little bit more exciting. I got Bronte involved. Originally, it was just Ben and Cecelia, so it was a little less dynamic. And so that was a change that I made in dev edits, just to kind of make it a little bit more exciting. I really didn't end up heavily editing Act 3 much. This isn't uncommon for me. Like, by the time I get there in drafting, like, I have a momentum from the characters and the plots, and it all kind of comes together. So really the most of my dev editing, like the heavy editing, Act 1, kind of polishing and going over what I'd already revised, and Act 2, because it was the first time I was really revising Act 2 at all. That friend of mine who read my local reader, my friend reader Lexi, gave me some really good notes as well that I applied in this dev pass, including the town's too fancy, like the school's a little too rich. Like, originally it was a much nicer high school, and then I changed it to it's not nice except for the new wing, which is Mora Weston. I was excited to kind of turn the dial up on the have and have not. She said, like, in like these towns, it really is like there are a couple rich people, but for the most part people really aren't that wealthy. So I was able to really turn up that dial. And her other really funny note was, it's Northern California, and it's this region of Northern California needs more weed. So that's why there are pot brownies in the book, though I had to compromise with my editor. She was like, originally Cecelia partook, and she was like, does she have to? I promise my editor generally is not a pearl clutcher. She's let me do a lot of crazy stuff, as you know, in my books. And they drink, but we made a slight compromise with Cecelia not partaking. Everyone else does, so it feels very Northern California, and I specifically, talking with my friend Lexi, like, that's why Bronte just casually, you know, there's weed and it's not a big deal. They're not like stoners. It's not that stereotype. Normal, over high achieving students partake in weed, and it's really not a huge deal. Though that's also where I got the details about kind of like some corrupt cop stuff with weed in the region. That is all real, based on, you know, conversations I had with my friend, because she's really familiar with the region and some of the like political stuff that they deal with. So I loved adding those textural details to it. Which brings me to the ending. As I mentioned, I turned in the first draft and we decided to kill Mara. So I rewrote the very end of the book. It got a lot shorter. So originally, and maybe someday I'll pull it out and polish it up and share it with fans of the book. Originally, Mara survived her fall down the dumbwaiter, critically injured, definitely in the hospital. And Cecelia goes to the hospital for her injuries, and I actually had a whole sequence there of her having like a chilling last conversation, both with her grandmother and with Ben. I love that beat in the story. I love stories that have that beat where you get that one final conversation after he's been arrested. Like, I had him like handcuffed to a hospital bed with like a guard outside, and like one last chilling conversation. And a part of me, like, I did want to keep it, and I I tried to keep it even with not having her grandmother alive at the end. But after kind of like doing a pass keeping it, it just like, I got stuck. Like I basically got partway through revising that ending and rewriting it with her grandmother being dead. And I was like, oh, my editor's not wrong. This is like momentum wise, this is kind of like not working. So you get the ending that is in the book now. I took a very different approach, a lot more concise, a lot more circumspect, with an epilogue. We love a happy ending found family epilogue, and I really loved writing that. And as I was writing it, I was kind of feeling my way into like Rima offering to put in a good word for Cecelia, and like this like off the page like sequel idea of like her going to college for criminal justice and ending up in the FBI. And in my mind, in my head canon, and that's why you got the ending that you got with her like looking at like the shelf of books dramatically. In my mind, she goes on a quest to dig into all of the people her grandmother may or may not have murdered, because she only confessed to so many. And I love that open-ended mystery part. And so that's why you got the ending that you got, the kind of found family happy ending. It's probably the happiest ending I have written for any of my thrillers and will write for my thrillers. The Ivies has a downer ending. The bitter end has a, I mean, you could call it a downer ending. I love it. It's a little sinister. And oh, when I jump into adult, it's all gonna be pretty bad. Bad in a good way. So this is probably the happiest ending you're gonna get from me in a thriller, but I ended up really loving the ending. I sent it all back in to my editor, and we did one more micro pass. We always do that. She always does one more line pass essentially, but she'll stick some dev notes into the final line pass of like, oh, this. So we made final tweaks to the book. Nothing crazy. You have to bear with me because it has been 3 years that I'm maybe mixing up some of these things and when they happen, and I'm sure I'm forgetting things. Down in the comments, feel free to be like, what about this part of the book? And you'll jog my memory and maybe I'll tell you how it worked. But you've definitely at least got a snapshot of like how much it changed for sure. I hope you've certainly gotten a snapshot of kind of the big changes and how much a book can definitely evolve from that, you know, 100 pages, which I think was like 30,000 words I originally submitted on proposal, and the original ideas and concepts that I threw out and totally changed. It's the most I've ever rewritten in Act 1, and it was totally worth it. You know, kind of the little things that I discovered as I was working on Act 2, things I wrote in the discovery and then dev edited, and the third act not changing a whole lot because I write towards a destination and I, you know, work on things along the way, but the destination doesn't really change. Though endings are always kind of in flux. Though, well, we'll wait till we talk about the bitter end. The bitter end was like the best of both worlds from my experiences writing the endings of the Ivies and Pretty Dead Queens. So that's for later, and hopefully I'll make that one a lot sooner than I ended up making this one. Nothing super notable happened in copy edits or past pages. It was pretty gentle because my editor and I, you know, really went to war on dev and line, like just the process of the back and forth of this book and like how long it took me to write and like sending it to her in chunks and like tweaking and revising and tightening. So pretty painless, though I did get one of the best comments I've ever gotten in copy edits on this book. The copy editor put a note right at the beginning of the manuscript that said, "Wow, what a story. As a copy editor, I pay a lot of attention to detail, of course, and I thought I knew for sure who the killers were. Turns out I was only half right. So kudos to you for keeping even the most careful of readers guessing." That edit made my day, made my week, made my year. One of the best notes I could have possibly gotten, because it is true. A copy editor's job, a huge part of their job, is literally continuity. They have to keep track of clues, and getting that comment was just like, because that was fall of 2021. So I technically started it in 2019, but really wrote it in 2020, but still like over 2 years of work and a lot of rewriting. So much, you know, rehashing and rewriting and tightening and refining and twisting and breaking my brain trying to have two convergent mysteries. Well, it was so much work. That was the payoff. That's what I wanted. I wanted it to be leaning into the it's always the boyfriend trope and hopefully delivering a really fun ride with that with some red herrings along the way. I imagine a lot of readers would read and go, oh, it's him, and then they'd second guess, but then they'd go, yes, it's him, and then they'd get the climax and think that was it, and then I'd punch them in the face with the grandmother reveal. That is what I wanted from this book, and getting that comment was like, oh, we laid the track. It worked for the copy editor, which was great to hear. And by and large, that's one of the reasons I'm so proud of this book. It tends to be the reception I get from readers. Like, not as many people have read Pretty Dead Queens as the Ivies, like by a lot. But those who have read it, who have talked to me about it, really like it. And I delivered a roller coaster ride. And once they got off the ride, I punched them in the face. And that is what I wanted from this book. That was my goal with this book, because I love mysteries like that. So I'm really proud of managing that. And part of that was, and I mean, I hope it worked. Haven't covered this yet, but part of this definitely was character psychology. A huge part of the drafting process, you know, in the first draft, I definitely was more like a Mack truck. I like powered through the mystery, not quite linear. Normally it's linear, but I powered through. I knew who the killers were and I knew how everything came together, and like making sure that I had enough of those threads on the page. And then as I did dev edits, multiple passes, it was really refining the character moments and the beats. And that's why, you know, it's good I threw out the Natalie party and taking out a beat with Mara at the breakfast table because maybe I was showing my hand a little too much, just making little tweaks. Having the hints, because essentially both of them have a mask off moment, and that was very intentional. Without armchair diagnosing my fictional characters, I absolutely intentionally wrote both of them with pathology. Slightly different pathology, but definitely kind of in the same family pathology. And I tried to be really careful to make it feel real, to make the charm feel real and believable, and yes, to some degree tricking, but I wanted astute readers to maybe think they were a little too charming. Like, that was intentional. And I wanted those micro mask off moments because I have literally experienced that in person. I've been with people who had a mask off moment, it's like their eyes just flip for a second and you doubt yourself and you question it. I wanted those moments with a pretty like trusting character. That's another benefit of Cecelia not being as anxious and paranoid and assuming everyone's always like judging them, because it meant they went past her a little bit, those moments. She didn't necessarily pick up the red flag she should have picked up, but they're there so that readers who read the book, it doesn't come out of nowhere that both of these characters are pretty awful. And it's not perfect because no book is perfect, but I spent a lot of time working on that. And for the most part, it's worked for a lot of readers. And that's one reason I'm so proud of this book. Oh, only one other copy editor note that I thought was funny and notable. In the first chapter, the copy editor wrote, "Will teens understand this Mrs. Danvers reference?" The pearls I clutched, and I wrote like a comment back that said, they can look it up. I was like, if this is what introduces them to the wonder of Rebecca and Gothic mystery tropes, they're welcome. Like, it's like a small thing, but it's like, it's the Gothic vibes. I mean, I get a Poe reference and a Mrs. Danvers reference in the first 3 pages. That was intentional. I love those vibes. I loved those vibes as a teenager. The whole idea is that Cecelia probably reads Gothic romantic mysteries, thus to have those references. I could totally see her loving the works of Poe. And I'm not even like a particular Poe fangirl, but I could see Cecelia being more into Poe. I'm a Rebecca girly. And they can learn. Because is it really a Gothic mystery if you don't have a Mrs. Danvers reference? A Mrs. Danvers type? And then as we get into final thoughts, the other elephant in the room I've barely talked about. There's a couple things in this book that I've barely talked about, mostly because it's been 3 years and my brain is a jumble. The grief of it all. This was the heart, at the time, It was the hardest book I'd ever written for a variety of reasons. Forgetting, I'm just throwing out dates. You probably noticed this is all during COVID. So I was trapped in my house. I was alone with cats. My cats were sick. One of them died while I was writing this. Yes, time, it's coming together. It was quite a time. And my mom died, obviously. Death, lots of isolation. It was a weird time, very weird. And in some ways that made it easier to write because I certainly had a lot of time to myself. In other ways it made it harder, of course. I did on this one, I had to relearn how to write at home because, as you know, one of my hacks is leaving the house to write and be productive, which still definitely works for me, but I couldn't do that here. I had to do all that writing at home. But it was emotionally hard for me to write, obviously. I directly funneled my own grief into this book. I'm glad I did. It's what I needed to do at the time, I think. And part of the challenge on some level, certainly though, was it is very different losing a parent at 17 than 35. There are commonalities, obviously, of losing a parent, period, but it's different when you're 17, and I that was good in a lot of ways. It gave me distance in a lot of ways because, you know, some of the morbid stuff that you, nihilist stuff that you deal with or think when you're 35, approaching middle age, and now I'm here and it's very weird. Very different when you're 17. You're gonna think about a lot of things when you're 17 differently when your parent dies suddenly. But it's different. So that protected me in some ways. Don't worry, it's gonna go in another book. I'm gonna write the really awful, depressing, nihilist stuff in adult. It's gonna be super great. But regardless, still, like, a lot of what Cecelia does in the book, a lot of the ways that she handles her grief, it's obviously a very heightened and sensationalist version because, you know, investigating a mystery, a murder, of course that's normal. That's what you do after your mom dies. It was like but it was a cipher for the ways that I unhealthily channeled my grief, including writing this book, the meta, the turducken meta of it. Yeah, I call this book my murder turducken. I forgot about that. But it was really cathartic and interesting, funneling my worst impulses into this character about grief, but also giving her a much neater arc than I had, a neater and faster arc. She's not fine by the end of the book. She's hardly healed. In fact, I don't think she's really begun to process her trauma, and I sincerely hope for her she gets a better therapist at the conclusion of this fictional book. But it was, writing is therapy often for a lot of us, in different ways. Like, writing the Ivies definitely allowed me to, like, think and process a lot about friendship. Like, one of my favorite things about that book, I wrote the line toward the end that, you know, some friendships, you know, they're of the moment and they exist in a specific moment in time, and then they end, and that's okay. Like, books are therapy. And then this one was very much, there was a lot about kind of like grief and writing some of my stuff in the book, and obviously though making it a lot worse. I hope I didn't crash awake and, like, you know, upset people. I didn't do that. Cecelia really goes a little too far in the course of this book, but I wanted to explore some of those destructive emotions while you're numb and kind of closing yourself off, and it was really therapeutic. I think it's kind of fun to share, like, a favorite line from a book. One of my favorites from the Ivies is that one I just rattled off semi-wrong probably, but the one about friendships, because that's truly something I believe, and I can't wait for you to hear the one from the bitter end that I stumbled into in the third act and went, that's the theme. Sometimes we surprise ourselves, but one of my favorite lines in this book, lines and scenes that I actually did fight for. I'm not going to read the whole thing, don't worry, I'm just going to read you the line, but if you've read the book, you'll probably know the scene. My editor actually, after I turned in the whole thing, wanted me to pull this back. It's very dramatic. And I basically explained, like, no, I'm keeping this because this is very real. These feelings are very real. I don't want to cry. And, like, she has to have this moment. Like, and one thing I am proud of and happy with, I did give this book to a beta reader before we did copy edits, and I didn't know when I gave it to them that their mom died of cancer when they were 17 years old. I told her the concept of the book, so she knew, she chose to read it, but when she told me that after, and it emotionally resonated with her, and I was like, because I was worried, because it's different when you're 35 than when you're 17. I didn't lose a parent at 17. A lot of this was imagining how much worse it would have been if I had been 17 instead of 35. When I lost my mother, though, the PTSD is really, really similar either way. But my favorite line in this book is, "The house sighs a final agonal breath, leaving silence." I know it's like nothing fancy, but I love that line, in part because like agonal breathing is horrifying. 0 out of 10. Don't recommend. PTSD. Hate. I actually put even more, I put additional dead body trauma into the bitter end. By the time I was editing it, I had enough distance that my editor convinced me to take some of it out. And then after this, she breaks down. And specifically, like, she realizes she's alone and that she wants her mom. And then she, like, observes that she's completely alone. And my editor thought this was a bit much. I'm like, no, sadly, that's how you feel. Like, and this poor character, I really torture her. She is actually really alone. She's more alone than I am, technically. I have aunts and uncles. I have cousins. This girl has nothing. Except for some good friends who I really hope last. My poor fictional babies. But, like, I'm glad, like, I fought to keep that moment. Like, sometimes you have to know what, like, feels emotionally, like, true for you. And maybe there are readers out there who hated that moment in this book. And if so, I'm sorry, but it's what I felt. Because ultimately, this is a grief book, and the process of writing it was awful sometimes, but also a lot of fun. It's frothy and fun. It's a very fun book, but it's a fun book with a pretty heavy, like, character core to it because of what I was going through. It's very reflective of where I was at the time that I wrote it, and it was therapeutic writing it. I got a lot of my feelings about death and dying and trauma and grief into this book in some small part as I was feeling it at the time. And I think that's one of the reasons, like, this book is probably also always going to be really special to me. It'll never be my bestseller. It'll, you know, never be the most popular book I've written, but it's probably gonna remain one of my favorites because it's personal and I'm proud of it. This book was so freaking hard to write. I leveled up so hard writing this book. And like, it's not a perfect book, but I do think a lot of that leveling up paid off in the bitter end, which was also a beast to write. Like, you're not even prepared for how bad the process on that book was. Like, I'm not ready to talk about it yet, but the leveling up paid off. Like, I had to go through a ton on this to make me a better writer, and all of that is going to propel me into writing adult and hopefully writing some good books. So, like, in a nutshell, that's from first draft to final book. This one was a beast, and it did all pay off. Like, sometimes you gotta write the book that, like, you're burning to write. Like, I knew that this wouldn't be as successful or popular as the Ivies because they're very different books. Like, the Ivies is technically kind of a thriller. It's like a suspense thriller. This is really more of a mystery suspense. It's got a more niche audience, but more crossover appeal, which it did on purpose. That's why the Edgar Award was, like, I mean, it was a shock. Like, I definitely have a video I made years ago where I was like, I'll never win any awards. And I still haven't won any awards, but I was saying that thinking I'd never be nominated either. And that specifically it was like the mystery writers of America who recognized that they enjoyed this as a meta mystery. You know, I put all my murder mystery writing stuff into here. Like that, like, it was really gratifying, just that recognition that, like, this one's not bad. I got the best trade reviews of my career on this book. School Library Journal basically gave it like the 1 tier below a starred review. I'm still chasing that elusive starred review, but they recommended it for all collections. And I talked to my librarian friends. They're like, that's great. Not just young adult collections, recommended for general collection. Like, that was, you have to take the wins where you can get them, and you have to, like, know what a book means to you and why you wrote it, and then be happy with it. Like, you can't always measure yourself by, like, sales or like taking the world by storm. It is almost good that I'm making this 18 months out from this coming out, almost 2 years, oh dear, because I've been able to kind of see the shelf life of it, and that it's not like a hotcakes bestseller. Hey, if you haven't read it, I mean, this is a little late in the video, you're probably not watching it. If you haven't read it, pick it up, it's in paperback now. But like, my happy feelings about this book and my feeling proud of writing this book remain. And just meeting with readers where this is their favorite of the books I've written, like that means something to me. It's like, yay, they also like the one that's my favorite. It's a nice feeling. So yeah, in conclusion, it's my grief book. It was kind of a hot mess to write, but I still really enjoyed the process, even when it was a lot. This book was therapy. I'm really proud of it. And yeah, I truly am positively positive I've skipped over things that you might be wondering about. Let me know questions down below and I'll blather at you in comments. This is going to be interminably long. Yeah, I promise to make, should I make promises I can't keep? I hope to make the bitter end one sooner rather than later. Not too soon, you gotta wait until the book comes out, because that one, I cannot talk about the bitter end without spoilers. Like, it's no fun talking about the bitter end without spoilers. Just like it was like promoting this was so hard. Guys, when there was that news story of that author who murdered her husband and wrote a book about it, do you know how badly I wanted to be like, if you like this, read this? Couldn't. Killed me. I'm surprisingly proud of a book that came from a meta internet joke about Jessica Fletcher and Murder, She Wrote. And that's Pretty Dead Queens. Ta-da! As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Even if I put it off, I do enjoy making these things. It's interesting kind of like going through my own process and like marveling at how much things change, but also don't change. Like, the core structure of this book never changed, but I did a lot of rearranging of organs, as I like to say. This one had a lot of surgery done on it, and it was all worth it. It was all worth the payoff. So thank you as always for watching, and happy writing for the writers and reading for the readers.